Hello, I'm Patrick J. Maxwell, and today we're over in Sheffield to meet a good friend of mine, Yaya Williams. He'll be telling us about systemic racism within education. I'm really looking forward to seeing what he's got to say.
My name is Jonathan Yahya Williams. I work for the Sheffield City Council as a senior learning mentor, but I've had various roles over the past 20 years. The majority of that time I've been working with young people who are at risk of exclusion from schools. And a large percentage of them have been from black and ethnic minority backgrounds. So I've had a lot of experience over the past 20 years in that area. I'm also doing a research doctorate, an Ed.D., which is a doctorate in education. And my focus is looking at disaffection amongst young people and their experiences of education. It's important to say when you look at school exclusions, there's a number of different social categories that you can identify that are most vulnerable. Because you've got to narrow down your research, I'm looking solely at Black Caribbean young people and looking at their experiences and looking at that specific community. A, because I've got access, it's in the interest of mine, I'm from that background myself. But B, also, there's a lot of research in this particular social group. For some reason, Black Caribbean kids and kids from the African background, they don't experience the same thing. African kids aren't excluded as much. Yeah, the attainment gaps aren't as big. There's not the same. So there's something clear there. In my research, I have spoke to one head teacher and a college vice principal about some of the young people I was working with who came from a Black Caribbean background. And the head teacher actually said, look, there's some young people that we've got here that have come from Africa and they've come from some real harsh conditions. They've come over here on asylum and they are flying. But you've got kids here who haven't had that same experience and they're struggling. Why is that? So he was seeing it himself. I haven't got enough data to look at that and to understand why, but for me, if I'm personal view on that, I would just say there's a lot to do with identity. You find that with many groups who sort of come from abroad and they might have a stronger sense of identity. So social inequalities might bounce off them. Because look, I personally believe this, if you struggle to know who you are, then any sort of negativity that you get, you'll internalise. And I think that there's issues with many young people. When it comes to, for instance, racism, people internalise it. So I had a similar conversation with my dad. When my dad came to England, the first experience he had of racism was when he first came to England. He never experienced that in the Caribbean. And I asked him what was he like, what happened, what did it feel like when he experienced it. He said he thought the people were really uncivilized and he was shocked. But he was in his 20s and he also knew where he came from. So he knew where home was, but he also had a strong sense of identity. So I think there's a lot of that to do with it. There may be other factors, but I personally believe that if you are struggling with a strong sense of identity, then any sort of negative that you get, whether it's racism or any sort of oppression, I think people internalise it. But if you know who you are, then it'll bounce off of you. In terms of systemic racism, there's been a lot of evidence that have supported that over the years. If you go back, even in, I think it was 1963, LGB Rose, she did a 5-year research that led to a book called Colour of Citizenship. And in her research, she looked at, and she was basically looking at housing. It was after sort of the Windrush generation. She was looking at housing. She was looking at education, she was looking at all these different social components, and one of the quotes that I got from what they said was they believed that by the year 2000 there would be a black underclass in Britain, right? And that was when they published that was 1967. 1975 you had Bernard Cord. Bernard Cord wrote a book, How the West Indian Child was made educationally subnormal within the British education system. Bernard Cord was from the Caribbean and he was a teacher in London. and he wrote this pamphlet to warn Caribbean parents, because at the time there was a lot of evidence that they had schools for kids who had special educational needs or was defined as educationally subnormal, and them schools was disproportionately being populated by black Caribbean kids, and there was an argument that said some of them had no special educational needs, and these schools was designed not to really give them a level of education. It was designed to make them able to survive within society, like functional skills, so low level education. And a lot of the parents didn't actually realise and understand that was taking place, that was getting transferred into these schools. And that's when Bernard Cord wrote this book. That's in the 1970s. Systemic racism in education and in society. You had sort of many riots, you know, the Brixton riots, that was a reintroduction of the SUS law. You had a lot of race relations acts that, you know, if the race relations acts weren't created, for me that's evidence that there is systemic racism, because they've brought in the Race Relations Act 1976, they amended that in 78, because there was, you know, things was changing. There was looking at, I think that Race Relations Act was only looking at overt racism in public houses like pubs. But as time went on, they started to ban overt racism in different places. Fast forward Stephen Lawrence and the Macpherson report, one of the recommendations was to look into racism, because he introduced the term institutional racism. And he looked at the legal system, the police force, but he also recommended to look into education. And that in 2000, they came with the sort of the Race Relations Amendment Act. So all these things have highlighted over the years that there has been systemic racism taking place. That is sort of evident. I think the question is now is why, what do you do to address it? Is it actually getting worse? Is it getting better? In education, one thing I found and I worry about is the fact that, for instance, schools have now shifted in terms of the landscape of education. There's more academisation, and I think right now the only thing that really governs schools in terms of policing is Ofsted. Back under the Labour government, you had Ofsted inspectors that would need to do some race relations training, where they'd look at theory and they'd have an exam. So you'd have to do that in order to be an Ofsted inspector. When the Conservative government came in 2010, they removed that. So you don't need to have that level of knowledge of institutional racism or of understanding critical race theory to go into a school. So you don't actually know what you're looking for. So some of those are examples of what you could say is systemic racism. The numbers in terms of attainment gaps, in terms of exclusions, they tell a story, but they only tell part of the story. There has been evidence that has clearly shown that with black and ethnic minority kids, sometimes teachers can underscore them. So some kids have been getting better grades in terms of what the teachers predicted. So there's a level of low expectation there, and that is true. There was some research that was done in, I forgot where, I think it was Bristol, and they looked at young people who was predicted certain grades and the outcome, and there was underscoring those black and ethnic minority kids. Now, that highlights something, because that low level of expectation will also manifest in the practice teacher-pupil relationship. So that's just a figure, but what's happening in terms of the daily interaction in the classroom? You know, there's also a lot of evidence that highlights that in terms of young people progressing in terms of sets and streaming, you know, there's inequalities that occur there. So for instance, you have the SATs in the primary school, and a lot of the secondary schools, they go by the SAT tests, yeah? And they'll do another mid-term, end-of-term test to see where each young person is. But what's key to important to know is that young people can, if they do better, they can get moved up. If they perform better, they can get moved up, and some get kept down or some may get dropped. But it might seem that it's just the data, it's just the results of the test that is shaping that. It's not. Sometimes a lot of that comes in teacher discretion. So a teacher might feel, well, I won't put them up, because of their expectation of that young person. Prime example, my sister-in-law's a maths teacher, and she was teaching at the higher level paper, right? And it's important to understand as well, when you're talking about higher level papers in maths, it's not just that there's a certain level of grade you are allowed to get. If you're not in that higher level bracket, then you're not going to be able to access A's or anything like that, higher grades in particular maths. But it's also important that the methodology, what they teach is different. So if you're not in them higher level sets, then you're not getting access to that level of teaching as well. So she was teaching at the higher level set, and she had an Asian boy in her class that was working at a lower set. And they said, oh, we're going to pull him out and put him in his right set. And she said, no, leave him there. And because I think she was the head of the maths, she had a lot of autonomy. So her discretion kept him in there. He ended up getting an A* and going on to university. If she'd have pulled him out, he wouldn't have accessed it. So a lot of it's down to, as well, teacher discretion, which is not measured. It's only measured saying the data, yeah, the test results. Maybe it's down to the expectations. And there's another worrying thing. Young people go by adults' expectations, yeah, or that young person's expecting the adult to believe in them, where the adult's waiting for the young person to show them something that's going to contradict their internal belief. They may look at them and think, well, I don't think you're going to achieve that well. Could be down to dialect, the linguistics, the way they speak, whatever it is. It could be down to a racial stereotype that they might have. It could be down to anything. But that has an impact, so it's the interactions. The call to introduce Black history to the curriculum and it's been quashed, and how it would benefit all kids. I don't think it would just benefit kids, I think it would benefit teachers and parents as well. It would make them realise that there's been a lot of contribution that Black people have made in history. So if you're looking at inventors, so for instance traffic lights, I know a lot of teachers don't know this, that Garrett Morgan was a black guy who invented the traffic lights. If they look at Lewis Latimer, who invented the filament for the light bulb. You've got Daniel Hale Williams, who invented the blood transfusion. All these different things, and it goes on and on. For Black children in particular, I think that would actually make them realise that there's other people just like them that have succeeded. People strive for things that they can see. If you can't see yourself in a position, then it's hard for you to kind of strive for it, isn't it? And I think that's across all sort of boards. Everybody plays a role. And if the only images you see are negative, then unfortunately they're the things that people strive for. And that's inequality itself. So yeah, it would be a benefit for not just kids, but to teachers and people as well. In summary, I would say that, look, to address inequalities within education, it's a massive task. But there's no one problem. There's a number of different issues. There is a lack of knowledge and understanding within that at high levels, people in positions of power that don't quite understand what the issues are. It's been very important not to play this blame game, because nobody wins. Yeah, nobody wins. Yeah, if I'm on one side and they're on another side, and you know we're all at each other's throat, kids are in the middle, they lose out. Nothing changes. And then there's policy. Policy is a big thing, because policy and how policy is enacted, and what shapes that inaction and how it manifests on the ground, that's another overall area. So policy has to change. It has to change at the top. It has to be a situation where it's just like attainment and grades are very important, so does the well-being of young people. That has to be equally important. And if we put all that together, and that's implemented in policy, not just in words, but also in practice, and it's monitored and audited, then I think you've got to step forward.
So as you can see, there are many facets in this discussion on systemic racism within education. Our next port of call is with the local government to see what issues they're having with systemic racism, if any, and what they're doing to address them.